It is 8:30. Actually, here it's 5:30, but I'm going to go with Eastern time. My name is Yitzchak Etshalom. I'm delighted to be studying with you on Torah in Motion. This week is Parshat Chayei Sara, of course, a very special Shabbat. In a lot of ways, as you may know, this is Shabbat Chevron, and tens of thousands of people descend on the city of Hebron and spend Shabbat there in a very festive manner, commemorating the beginning of our parasha. And we're going to actually focus on the beginning of our parasha, but just quickly so that we don't lose sight. Our parasha is made up of three parts, and they are essentially life cycle. The beginning and the end are death and burial, and the middle is marriage, right? Sarah's death is recorded, and to be honest, her death is recorded mainly because of what comes along with it, which makes up the bulk of that chapter, which is the purchase by Abraham of the field of Machpelah with its cave, where she's buried, then he's buried, and then Yitzchak and Rivka buried, and Yaakov and Leah are buried. The end of the parasha brings us full circle, or should we say completes that piece, with the death of Abraham, who is buried next to Sarah there. We're told about the rest of Abraham's life, his marriage to Turah and the other kids he has, and sending them away, and giving everything he has to Yitzchak. And then it ends with the life and death, the years and death and the progeny of Yishmael, which is its own parsha, why it's there and not our concern. The main content thematically and the main content size-wise of this week's parasha is actually devoted to the finding a wife for Yitzchak, which is its own fascinating story. I'll just give you a couple things to think about, because we're not going to talk about it tonight, but a couple things to think about that story, which makes up all of Perek Chaf Daled, all 67 psukim of Perek Chaf Daled, and a couple things to think about. First of all, it starts out with Abraham telling his slave to put his hands under the slave's hands under Avram's thighs in order to make an oath. The question is, why does he do that? And you'll notice that the same thing happens one other time, and that is when Yaakov is on what he thinks to be his deathbed, and he has Yosef to bury him in Hebron and not in Egypt. So something to think about. The second thing is, what's wrong with Canaanite girls? That's the whole oath, is that Yitzchak should not marry a local girl. And the reality is that there are at least three distinct approaches taken in the Rishonim as to what's wrong with the Canaanite girls. Anybody's interested can go to YU Torah. And this week I gave a shiur where I surveyed them and they proposed a fourth reason. The third thing, which is quite interesting, is that the oath that Abraham was given, or that Abraham gave a slave, was not to take a girl from the Canaanite girls for Yitzchak as a wife, and rather to go back to his ancestral home and find somebody from the family. And a piece of that was, and Yitzchak cannot leave the land, the girl has to be ready to come to the land and leave everything behind. And so you would expect that if the slave was really a loyal slave, that he would come to Haran and he would assemble the townspeople. And he said, is there anybody among you as a daughter who you're willing to send off to a foreign land to marry a very rich fellow, spend the rest of her life there? Instead, the whole prayer that he has, which is a nichush, a cholkat rishonim, and we see that positively or negatively, the Rambam and the Ravid and others, but his nichush about the girl comes out with the water, etc., how does that fulfill the command, the oath that he took to his master? And he gets lucky in that he ends up with a girl who's from the family, but that shouldn't have been his direction. So why did he do that? And the fourth thing, which is a much longer piece, but is something fascinating to look at, and I'm doing this to clear the deck so that you have lots of things to think about in the context of the main part of this parasha, because we're going to focus our energies on the beginning, and that is look very carefully at the story of Rivka and the slave, and tell me at what point does she realize that he's a slave? And look how carefully the text uses the word ish and eved differently. When Rivka is looking at him, he's an ish. When he's speaking on his own to the family away from her, he's an eved. When the text describes him, he's an eved. And the question is, did Rivka really know where she was going when she left home? Something to think about. But now let's take a look at the beginning of the parasha. So the beginning of the parasha is about Abraham's purchase of the me'ara, of the field and the me'ara in Hebron. And the truth is that Hebron is one of the only two cities that Abraham actually settles in. Abraham is in Shechem. Abraham is between Beit El and Ha'ai. Abraham is obviously in Egypt. Abraham is in Gerar. And in none of those places does he settle down. He's always wandering and roving, certainly at the beginning of the story. The first place that he settles down is in Hebron. We'll take a look at those psukim. And the second thing is that he settles in Beersheba. That's the other city that he settles in. Why those two cities and when does he live in each place actually tells us quite a lot about the Abraham story and about the Avot in general, and perhaps is somewhat instructive as to the delicate balancing act between raising children and having an impact on the community. Parenthetically, and I know there are other people in the shiur who are part of rabbinic families, and you know how much of a delicate balance and a difficult balance it is to maintain your own family education along with serving the education of the community. And so we're going to see hopefully some insights into that. I want to start at the Akedah. The Akedah is always an interesting place to start. But there's something curious that happens at the end of the Akedah. Avraham, as you know, tells Ne'arav. Who are Ne'arav? Ne'arav are the two boys who are not Yitzchak. And he says, you stay here with the donkey. Vani v'hana'ar nelcha adko. So all three of them are called Ne'arim. And now, at the end of at the culmination, at the high point of this whole story, when Avram raises his hand to slaughter Yitzchak, the Malach stops him and says, Al tishtach edcha el hana'ar, which means that Yitzchak is called a Na'ar here again. And now at the end of the story, and this is the curious part, Vayashav Avraham el Ne'arav, Avraham returns to Ne'arav. Vayakumu yachtav el Be'ersheva. Vayakumu yachtav el Be'ersheva. They get up and they go together to Beersheba. Vayeshev Avraham Be'ersheva. And Avraham lives in Beersheba. Again, that's the place that he lives, Vayeshev. Now, where is Yitzchak in this whole story? And you have to remember, in the Akedah, I'm sure you all know it by heart, in the Akedah, Yitzchak is present in the text until the very moment that Avram raises his knife to him. At that point, it's Avraham and the Malach. The Malach speaks to Avram. Avram obeys him. And then Avram runs and gets a ram and brings the ram up in place of Yitzchak. We don't know where Yitzchak is. We're not told that Avram takes him off the Mizbeach, although we have to assume he does. We're not told if Yitzchak is standing by watching as Avram brings the Korban, or if Yitzchak leaves, runs away. Does he go join the other two guys? Does he disappear? But the curious thing is that Yitzchak actually doesn't show up in the narrative again until Rivka comes with the slave back to Beersheba, and then he marries her. Which means when Sarah dies, purchases a machpelah, his own mother died, purchases a machpelah, Yitzchak is nowhere to be seen. And so the question is, where is Yitzchak? But part of the interesting mystery here is, how do we interpret verse 19, verse Yotet, Vayashav Avraham el Ne'arav, he returns to his Ne'arim. How many? Does that mean he returns to the two and Yitzchak's not there? Or does it mean that Yitzchak joined them and he returns to all three of them and they go together to Beersheba? Now we get a little bit of a hint that Yitzchak's part of that group, because notice the words, Vayakumu vayachu yachtav. And if you remember from earlier in the story of the Akedah, twice Avraham and Yitzchak are called Yachtav, Vayachu Shnehem Yachtav, which is pretty much the same thing. Vayakumu Vayachu Yachtav. So it sounds like Yitzchak's part of this, and they end up in Beersheba. Okay. Interesting is in the very next scene, Sarah is in Hebron. And in the end of the second part of the shiur, we're going to look at the name of Hebron. But Vatamot Sarah beKiryat Arba hi Hebron be'eretz Canaan. Sarah dies in Kiryat Arba. Now again, Yitzchak is not to be seen in this in here. And now Vayavo Avraham vayispod l'spod l'Sarah v'livkotah. Avram now comes to mourn for Sarah, to weep for her, and then of course he he ends up buying the land, and that's the end of the parak. Where's Yitzchak in this whole scene? And notice, Abraham went back with the boys, 2 or 3, to Beersheba, and the next scene we see Sarah dying in Hebron. And now Abraham comes to mourn for her. Does that mean he comes from Beersheba? Or does it mean, like Ramban says, Ivayavo means he stirs himself to mourn, but he's in Hebron with her? In which case, why is Abraham living with Sarah in Hebron and Yitzchak somewhere else in Beersheba? And why those 2 towns? So now when we look at the scene that I elaborated on at the beginning of the shiur about sending the slave to go get a wife for Yitzchak, we have Avraham Zaken Ba Bayamim. Bayamim is a biblical idiom for he thinks he is on his deathbed, or he thinks he's on his deathbed. And Avraham then has his Eved take an oath, right? And the Eved comes and tells his story, etc. Where are they when this is happening? It seems that they are in Hebron when this is happening, which means Avram is living in Hebron alone. Meantime, maybe he's already married Keturah, and he sends his slave to Haran to find a wife for Yitzchak. But where's Yitzchak? And the slave doesn't come back to Hebron. The slave comes to Beersheba, and there Yitzchak, without Avraham, Yitzchak is out in the field. He comes from Be'er Lachairoi, which has become a family shrine, and Yitzchak is out in the field there, and Rivka sees him, and they get married. Now, an interesting little thing that happens in this story, just as a piece in our parsha, is if you look at Pasuk Lamed Vav, which is highlighted, it's in purple. When the slave tells his story, he says, "Vateled Sarah eshet Adoni vein la Adoni." It is very clear in this sentence that this is a slave of Avraham. Sarah is the wife of my Lord. She gave him a son to my Lord, right? And now when we come to Beersheba and we're approaching, Rivka looks up at this man in the field and asks the Eved, who is it? And if you look at Pasuk Samechei, Vayomer Eved, Hu Adoni. So who is the master of the slave? Is it Avraham or is it Yitzchak? It's a little bit clear, a little bit unclear. And notice that in these 2 scenes, the scene of the death of Sarah, Yitzchak is absent. In the scene of Avraham charging the Eved, Yitzchak is absent. And when Yitzchak marries Rivka, Avraham is absent. And we know just from the calculations that Avraham is still alive when Yitzchak marries Rivka. Yitzchak marries Rivka at the age of 40, which means Avraham is 140. He's still middle-aged for him. He's got another 35 years to go. So we got to figure out who's living where and what are they doing in these places. Now, notice when we first come to when Avram first comes, we're going to backtrack. When Avram first comes to the land, he comes to Shechem. Hashem appears to him, says, "I'm giving your kids this land." Avram builds a mizbeach and keeps moving. And he builds a mizbeach between Beit El and Ha'ai, and he keeps moving south. And then there's a famine, he goes to Egypt. Then he comes back, and he comes back to that place, and there he's hanging out with Lot, and their shepherds get in the fight, and Lot and he separate. And Avram then moves south. And for the first time, we hear about him settling in. Vayahal Avram ve'avo in Pasuk Yod Chet in source 4, Vayeshiv be'elonei mamrei asher b'Chevron. Right? So he lives in Hebron. Now, who is Avraham now? Avraham is soon going to become a local hero. He's a military hero. Avraham is recognized as a lordly man among them. And Avraham is an elderly man now without any children. Notice that when the famous War of the Kings happens, where's Avraham? Palit, one guy escaped from the, I'm familiar with the Midrash about Og, one guy escaped from the war, and a refugee, and he runs. Avram is living in Elonei Mamre, which means that's where he lives. That's where he resides. That's Hebron. Okay. But now move ahead to Prakim. Avraham, after that war, there's the famous Brit Ben Abatarim, and subsequent to the Brit Ben Abatarim, Sarah turns to Avram and says, "I'm not having any kids. I have an Egyptian concubine, Egyptian maid. Take her as a wife. Maybe she'll have children, and maybe that through that I'll be built, whatever that may mean. Famous story, Avram takes Hagar as a wife. She gets pregnant evidently right away. And she evidently behaves in a less than respectful manner around Sarah. Sarah gets upset, and Avram says, do what you want. Sarai mistreats her, and Hagar runs away. Where does Hagar run away to? Well, take a look. Source 8 and source 6. Malach Adonai al ein hamayim bamidbar. The Malach finds her at a well. Al ha'ayin b'derech Shur, on the road to Shur. Where's the road to Shur? It is North Sinai. So where did she run from? She ran from Avram's tent back towards home, back towards Egypt. In other words, away from Beersheba, which means that when Hagar is pregnant, they're living in Beersheba, right? And she ends up naming that Be'er. That's Be'er Lachai, which is the same place that Yitzchak went to when he lives in Beersheba. That's a family shrine. Okay. Now we move ahead, and we're not sure where Avraham is in the next chapter, where the mitzvah of Brit Milah is given. But when we get to the famous scene with the three men visiting, where are Avraham and Sarah? He's back in Hebron. Now you can argue winter home, summer home if you want, but that's a bit much considering he's a nomad. So that normally nomads don't operate that way. They settle somewhere until they kind of become uncomfortable and they move. But Hashem appears to him in Elon Mamre. He's back in Hebron. And this is when the famous announcement of Sarah's going to have a child. Now, after the destruction of Sodom, after that whole story, Abraham moves from there, Artsah HaNegev. He goes to the south again. And he goes to the Plishti land, and he ends up in the area of Beersheba. Now, scroll ahead, and you see that Abraham is, when Yitzchak is born, and after a couple of years, there's a big party for Yitzchak, and Sarah sees Yishmael and Yitzchak interacting in whatever way it may be, whatever mitzachek may mean. It was a way that displeased Sarah. And Sarah says to Abraham, send this kid out and his mother, he shouldn't inherit with my son, etc. What does Abraham do? Abraham gets up early in the morning, gives her water, gives her bread, sends her out to where? Bemidbar Be'er Shava. And the entire story here takes place around Be'er Sheva. And by the way, the next story after that, which is Abraham and Avimelech, make a brit in Be'er Sheva. That's why it's called Be'er Sheva. It's the oath, it's the well of taking an oath, because they take an oath there. And that's where Abraham is. Now, notice the last pasuk in source 10. Vayagor Abraham Eretz Plishtim Yamim Rabim. Lagur is not lashevet. It's not to dwell. It's to sojourn. It means to move around, to not really be settled in Eretz Plishtim. But in Beersheba, he settled in. So, what are we to make of this? Why is Abraham in Hebron? Why is he in Beersheba? Why does he move back and forth? And why only those two places? So take a look at these psukim, and again, the colors are not intended to be seasonal, but notice that when Abraham dies, Yitzchak and Ishmael come to Hebron to bury him, and that's where he's buried. But where does Yitzchak himself live? In Be'er Lachai Roi. Yitzchak is near Beersheba. Why the difference? I want to just move ahead because we're going to see the same pattern happen in the next generation. And I'll cut to the chase a little bit here, in that when you see Yitzchak, when there's a famine, Yitzchak tries to go to Egypt, God stops him, so he lives in Gerar. And he comes from there to Beersheba, and he stays in Beersheba. And he renames the town Beersheba, etc. Yitzchak sends Esav out when he's an old man, right? And all that whole scene happens with the theft of the brachot. All happens where? In Beersheba. How do I know that? Because Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheba, the beginning of Parshat Vayetze, after the theft of the brachot, and after Yaakov has to run away to save his life, and is going to go to Haran, and is going to go marry Lavan's daughter. He doesn't know that it's going to be daughters. Where does he leave? He leaves from Beersheba, which means the family's in Beersheba. After all those years in Haran, Yaakov comes back to where? To see his father. Mother evidently died in the meantime. Comes back to see his father. Where's his father living? Kiryat Arba, Hebron. And Yaakov now lives in Hebron. How do I know that? Because when Yaakov sends Yosef to go see his brothers on that ill-fated trip, Hebron. So what do we make of all this? So I'm going to take you off share for a moment so we can all see each other a little bit. And I'll suggest the following, because what we've seen now is a pattern that doesn't seem to make sense. It's a zigzag. It's a pattern of where Avraham and then Yitzchak and then Yaakov live. And all of them, all three of them, live at some point in Hebron and at some point in Beersheba. Yitzchak also lives in Gerar for a while. That's when he wants to go to Egypt. But the reality is it's only Hebron and Beersheba. Those are the places they live. So in order to understand what's going on, we have to actually understand some of the demography of the land. What is Hebron? What is Hebron? Hebron is a major city. It is a city that has its own town council. It is a city where people come and trade. It is something of a crossroads. A lot of things going on in Hebron. What is Beersheba? Beersheba is, as they like to say, the gateway to the Negev. Beersheba is really like an outpost almost. Beersheba is your last stop on the way to Egypt. We see that, for instance, with Yaakov. When Yaakov goes down to Mitzrayim, he stops in Beersheba before leaving the land to sort of say goodbye to the land and say goodbye to God. It's the last time Hashem speaks to him is in Beersheba, beginning of Perek Mem Vav in Bereshit. So what's Avram doing? So let's think about the Avrahamic mission. Avraham's job is a complex job. His task is multifaceted with different subcommands or alluded commands which don't necessarily work together well. One of them is to be a beacon of light to the whole world, to be a source of blessing for all families of the world. That's great. An international spokesman for God, if you will. And on the other hand, Abraham is supposed to raise a family, not only a big nation that he's promised, but if you look carefully at Perek Yudchet, Pasuk Yudchet Yudtet, you'll see God says, I know that he is going to teach his children to keep Derech Hashem, which means Abraham is, if you will, caught between the obligation to be a public figure and be successful at that, and to be a father, a private father, and be successful at that, to raise his kids the way they're supposed to be. And I think we all know people who have excelled at one and failed miserably at the other, or shall we say, the report card is not A's across the board. It's a very hard balance to keep. It's one of the most remarkable things, I believe, about my Rabbi, Rabbeinu Aaron Lichtenstein Zatzal, his ability to be an amazing teacher to all of Klal Yisrael and yet raise an amazing family. It's not simple. Hebron is a very public area with a lot of interaction, a lot of international interaction. Abraham lives in Hebron when he's not raising children. Abraham lives in Hebron when he first comes to the land, and after he finally settles down, he settles in Hebron. That's the place. That's Ir Havot, will become Ir Havot for us. He settles there, and he interacts, and he makes britot with Aner Eshkol and Mamre, who live there, and he becomes a Nasi Elohim Ata B'tochenu. Everybody in the town looks up to him. He's a very godly man. He's influenced and impacted on people. That's great. When Hagar gets pregnant, they move to Beersheba. They move to the middle of nowhere, where the only people he's ever going to see are going to be people either in his own family and tribe, or else people will come to seek him, like Avimelech. There's nobody else around. And so when Hagar is pregnant and things don't go well, she runs out. It's the Midbar of Beersheba. Now, what happens after Yishmael is born? We suddenly find Avram back in Hebron. Why? Because Ishmael is already a young man. He's ready to be part of this community. Avram has done whatever he can to raise him. And the assumption is that Ishmael is with him, or if not, and perhaps Ishmael has stayed with Hagar in Beersheba, and Abraham now has moved to Hebron with Sarah. The three Malachim come to visit Abraham and give him the news. When Yitzchak is born, where do we find Abraham? Back in Beersheba. And this is the Shita. When I'm raising my kids, they're young and they're open to influence, I'm going to keep them far away from everybody. I'm going to keep them in an environment where I can raise them, because my environs, the country that I live in, the world that I live in, is a world of Avodah Zarah, is a world of fetishisms, about a world of all sorts of things that I don't want my kids to pick up. I'm going to raise them in a bubble. The minute they're ready, we move back to Hebron. And so what do we find? We find that when Yaakov and Esav are growing up, they're growing up in Beersheba. And Yaakov has to run away, runs away from Beersheba. When he comes back, where does he come back to? To Hebron, because Yitzchak's moved to Hebron. Yitzchak finished raising his kids. They've already gone their own way. He moves back to Hebron. And where does Yaakov stay as an older man with his kids already grown and having children of their own? In Hebron. So it solves some of the problems we have in the text of understanding why the text goes back and forth, why the avot go back and forth between those two particular cities. And it also may be instructive for us, perhaps some of us, in how we are able to maintain that delicate balance. Now, we can't necessarily do it, nor is it advisable, nor do we live in the same kind of corrupt and fetishistic world that Avram lived in. But it may give us a little bit of an idea of guidance of how it is that we're supposed to balance that public and private persona, the community teacher and the family raiser. And we see that model with Abraham, and then later on again with Yitzchak and Yaakov. That's part one. I see there are a number of questions here. So right now, we were between part one and part two of the shiur. I'm going to take some questions, all right, that I have in the chat. Somebody asked, where did Abraham come from? That is a famous machloket rishonim between Ramban and Rashi. Rashi says that Abraham was raised in Ur Kasdim and bases that on the pasuk in Tetvav pasuk Zayin. The Ramban, based on the events in our parsha, argues that Abraham came from Haran and that the family moved to Ur Kasdim for a short time and then had to leave. All right, so that's as far as the answer goes about where he came from. Now, David mentioned a question. I'm not sure I understand. Perhaps you can go on mic and tell me. She first refers to him as my master, Adoni. Well, who are you speaking about? You're talking about Rivka?
Rivka, yeah. You asked when she realized she was a slave. So initially, she clearly didn't think he was a slave.
Exactly. Very good. The first time she speaks to him, she says, Shtei Adoni, drink, my lord. And the whole time, if you look through the story, you'll see perhaps she doesn't know what's going on. And she, this is based on an article that Professor Perry wrote years ago, and I think is a quite very convincing one. Okay, now, Ira asked a question, was Abraham in Beersheba? I apologize because I don't know at what point in the shiur you asked this. Was Abraham in Beersheba, Har HaMoriah, were they living in two locations? Are you asking about the beginning of our parsha, where Abraham comes to Hebron? Where's Ira? Okay, if you're able to come on mic and tell me, because I'm not sure what you mean by the question. All right. Biblical Beersheba from biblical Hebron is probably half a day's walk, even less, right? If that helps. Yeah, so you asked, interesting thing, at the end of the Akedah, if Yitzchak and Avram joined the other two boys, shouldn't it have said, Vayashuvu Avram v'Yitzchak el hanarim? Yeah, that would make sense. The interesting thing about the Akedah is the Akedah, even though we call it Akedah Yitzchak, we call it that, the entire spotlight's on Abraham. We have no idea what Yitzchak's saying or thinking or how he's responding, what his reaction is when he's put on the Mizbeach. We don't know any of that. But what we also don't know is anything that happens to him after Avram's hand is stayed. So we don't know if Yitzchak went and joined the Na'arim over there, and then Abraham goes and joins them, which may be Vayashav al Na'arav. Na'arav might be all three of them. So it wouldn't be Abraham and Yitzchak to them, it'd be Abraham to the three of them. Right. So the question you asked, why was Sarah in Kiryat Arba and Hebron when she died? If Avram was living in Beersheba, right, then that becomes difficult. So that's why the Machloket Rashi and Ramban, but they both seem to have the impression that Avram and Sarah are living in Hebron, and either that Abraham, if you base it on the midrashic take of Seder Olam, that the Akedah and the death of Sarah happened at the same time, then that means Avram returns to Beersheba from where he left for the Akedah, and then got the news that Sarah died and went to there. But then you have to wonder, why did he go to Beersheba at all if he's living in Hebron? And so the simplest explanation is that the two did not happen at the same time. He returns to Beersheba because that's where the family lives. And after the Akedah, and Yitzchak has now gone through whatever rite of passage we want to call it, he's now ready to move to Hebron and leave Yitzchak in Beersheba. And indeed, the two of them never see each other that we hear of in their lives. Yitzchak, of course, is there at the burial. Right. So you said, how I don't follow. One can derive from Agar's escape that Avram and Sarah were living at that time in Beersheba. Very simply because she goes and wanders in the area of Beersheba, and she comes to a well that's Be'er Lacharoi, which we know is right near Beersheba. All right. In any case, I'm gonna move it to the second half of the shiur. Although you guys all ask very good questions, and that is Kiryat Arba Hebron. Something interesting that I'm sure you've noticed is that every time that Kiryat Arba is mentioned, nearly every time that Kiryat Arba is mentioned in Tanakh, it's always mentioned with Hebron, meaning Kiryat Arba Hebron. Now, by the way, this is an identifier that we have when it comes to two kinds of names, personal names and toponyms, place names, that have two identifiers. That on occasion, the text will identify that A and B are the same. For instance, Hadassah hi Esther. The text tells us that the girl whose name is Hadassah, by the way, she has another name, Esther, but it only does that once in the text. And from then on, every time we know Esther, we know we're talking about Hadassah. Okay, very good. It doesn't happen too often, but on occasion we do hear personal name that is given two names, and we're told that they have a person, like Gidon, Yerubal hu Gidon in Shoftim Zayin, right? Yerubal hu Gidon. And therefore we know every time it mentions either one of them, we know that it's the same person. That, by the way, is an important point midrashically, because one of the interesting approaches of the midrash, commonly in narrative, is to resolve anonymity, and that is when somebody is mentioned without a name, to try to associate them with the name of somebody else that we know from another story. Maybe the most famous example of that is that in Parshat Shlach, we hear about a guy who's out in the field on Shabbat, Mikoshesh Eitzim. We don't know his name. He ends up getting killed for Chilul Shabbat, and we don't know his name. And so famously, Rabbi Akiva comes and, using a Gzerah Shabbat, says it was Slof Chad. And Rabbi Yoshua ben Natera says to him, Akiva ben kach atatin l'tein adin. One way or the other, you're going to pay for what you said. Either you're right, in which case the Torah kept it undercover and you exposed it. The Torah didn't want you to know who it was, or else you're wrong and you're besmirching the name of an innocent guy, right? But the Midrash is interested in resolving anonymity. And so the Midrash says, well, here we have Sarai. We don't know anything about her. Here we have somebody named Yiska, who seems to be famous, but we don't hear anything. And so we put them together. Sarai is Yiska. We have Keturah, seems to come out of nowhere. And Hagar seemed to disappear. So Keturah is Hagar. Now, we're familiar with these Midrashim. However, we don't hear it with people names, usually more than once, in the case of their own life. Hebron is really kind of unique. Because almost every time that we mention Hebron, it's Kiryat Arba Hebron. Let's take a look. We see it here, but Talmud Sarah Kiryat Arba Hebron. Now, Hebron, by the way, is part of Hebron. An area near Hebron is Elonei Mamre. So Elonei Mamre Asher b'Hebron. When you talk about the city itself, it's Kiryat Arba Hebron. So the beginning of our Parsha, Kiryat Arba. Now, by the way, why is Kiryat Arba called Kiryat Arba? What kind of name is that? Kiryat means city. So what's Kiryat Arba mean? What kind of name is that? So I will tell you while you're waiting, because I'm waiting to hear from somebody. You guys can all unmute yourselves and answer. While I'm waiting for somebody, I'll tell you this very cute
The
story.
city of four giants.
City of four. Go ahead. Debbie, go ahead.
The city of four giants.
The city of four giants. Okay, good.
Four friends of Abraham.
Right. So the city of the four giants, right? That's Achiman, Shesha, right? The Anakim. Could be. If you look in Yoshua, we'll take a look in the Pasuk, it seems that Arba is actually somebody's name. Kiryat Arba, meaning the Kiryat that this fellow Arba founded. All right. And we'll see support for that in a moment. There is a famous midrash. It's the town in which there are four famous couples that are buried, because of course Adam and Chava in the midrash are buried there also. But that's very difficult for a lot of reasons, including the fact that it's called Kiryat Arba before Avram even buys it. It's difficult. In any case, Kiryat Arba Hebron consistently. Now, what we're going to try to get to in this shiur is, why is Kiryat Arba also known as Hebron, and why the constant mention of the two of them together? Parenthetically, why would the text ever do that with a place? And the reason is quite straightforward. If you come to a place that you know is Beit El, you know it's Beit El because my ancestors prayed here, and we have a story that Yaakov had his vision here, Beit El. And you meet a local guy, and the guy says, no, the name of the town is Luz. So the text says, Luz is Beit El. So you should know that some people call it Luz. We renamed it Beit El. They still call it Luz. Take a look in Shoftim Perek Aleph. So it's helpful to know that because there may be two identifiers. There may be another reason for it. Sefer Breshit has a particular advantage and a challenge to it. Because when was Sefer Breshit written? When was the text of Sefer Breshit written? What do we assume?
Moshe wrote it.
Right, which means that Breshit is going to reflect knowledge and awareness at the time of Moshe that there may not have been earlier. So, for instance, in the Parshat Lech Lecha 2 weeks ago, we read that Avraham chased the kings all the way north to Dan. How could Avraham chase the kings to a place named after his great-grandson? But of course, he chased them to a place, and by the time Moshe is writing the Torah, that place is known as Dan. And so therefore it says on Dan. A parallel to that would be if you had a story about some people settling on an island in the 1500s, somewhere on the east coast of New York, and they set their first thing up somewhere near Midtown, Midtown Manhattan. It wasn't Manhattan. There was no Midtown. There was nothing there. But today we know where Midtown Manhattan is. You want to give an identifier, you give it that way. So sometimes you'll have an identifier in the Torah, which will be there to say that's what they called it, but we know it this way. Right? Very good. For instance, in the story of the kings, we hear about Stei HaAmaleki. How could you have a Stei HaAmaleki, a field of Amalek? Amalek is Esav's grandson. How did he get there? The answer is by the time the Torah is written, that's how we know it. But that would only make sense once. It doesn't make sense that every time we mention Kiryat Arba, it's Hebron, or Hebron and Kiryat Arba. So let's take a look. So the Rashbam, mentioning just like one of you said, Kiryat Arba, Shem Ha'ish Arba. So not that there are four people, but rather there's a guy named Arba. Yoshua, he quotes the pasuk in Yoshua, Kiryat Arba, v'Anak. Kamo Kiryat Sichon. We have the town of Sichon. Okay. We have more support for that from the Septuagint. You're all familiar with the Septuagint. I hope I'll give a quick word on it just in case. The Septuagint is the oldest known translation of the Torah into any other language. And the Septuagint which was translated originally in probably the 2nd century BCE. by Jewish sages, by Jewish scholars into Greek for the benefit really of the king and perhaps the library in Alexandria, and ultimately for the Alexandrian Jewish community that didn't know Hebrew anymore. And in the Septuagint, one of the big advantages we have is that we also hear how words are pronounced because we're seeing them put with Greek consonants. And it helps us understand how Hebrew was pronounced, certainly personal names and etc. In those days. In any case, here's our pasuk. Kaya Pefanen Sarah, Sarah died, and Pole Arbok, the city of Arbok. So in other words, as far as they're concerned, Arba is the name of a guy, and their version of it is Arbok. Now notice what they add. Hey, Estin Eintoi Koilomati, which is in a valley. Valley, not in our pasuk. Look at pasuk in source 17. Doesn't say valley anywhere there. And then Ote Estin Chevron, which is Chevron. That you have in the pasuk, right? And then which is in Canaan, and then the rest of the pasuk. If you take a look here this is one of the versions that we have that identifies in certain texts differences that exist. You can see that on the right side of Tamot Sarah B'Kiryat Arba, and then El Emek Hi Chevron. There's an Emek thrown into here. What the heck is an Emek doing here? By the way, we all know that Chevron is a mountainous area, but somehow there's an Emek. I'll explain about the Emek in a moment. And now when we move up to the story of Yosef and Yaakov sending him to go see his brothers, Vayomer lo lechna re'eh et shlom achecha v'et shlom atzon, v'ashiveni davar. Go see how they're doing and come back and tell me. Vayishlachehu me Emek Chevron. Emek Chevron. That's very strange. And he comes to Shechem. How can you say Emek Chevron? So the reality is that, and as the Septuagint indicates, that there really is a valley in Hebron. As everybody here, most of you have been to Marat Machpelah. So if you notice that when you're standing outside of Marat Machpelah, you actually see a dip in the ground. You can have a mountain valley, meaning you're in the mountains, but within the mountains, there's an area that's sort of indented, right? That's an Emek Harari, Emek Hebron. And that's where Yaakov sent Yosef from when he sent him to Shechem, Emek Hebron. However, the Midrash won't have anything of it. Midrash is going to pick up on Emek Hebron and do some beautiful things with it. But this Midrash is probably going to bring us all the way back to Pshat. It's great. The Midrash starts out here in Masachet Sotah, Daf Yud Aleph. Vayishlacheu me'emek Hebron. Amar Rabbi Chanina bar Papa. What is Emek Hebron? Be'etza amuka shel otot tzadik shekavur b'Chevron. In other words, Yaakov sends Yosef to go see how his sons are doing in Shechem. And as far as Yaakov is concerned, maybe he's trying to get things to be patched up between the brothers, or maybe he wants to actually see if they're okay. We don't know. What the Midrash is telling us is that what Yaakov unknowingly is doing is he is initiating the move towards fulfilling Brit Ben Abatarim. Because Brit Ben Abatarim necessitates that Abraham's descendants end up enslaved in a foreign land and then leaving with great wealth and coming back to conquer the land. And so when Yaakov sends Yosef, that starts that ball rolling because the brothers throw him in the pit and we go from there. And so what's the drasha on Vayishlacheu me'emek Chevron? Not from the valley of Chevron, but from the deep, Amuk, vision and the deep prophetic advice that was given, prophetic message that was given to the tzaddik who's buried in Chevron, and that's Abraham. So Emek Chevron now becomes not a valley of Chevron, but the deep information of the one who's buried in Chevron, Abraham. You'll see it a little bit more clearly in the Psikta, and this is the Lekach Tov, which is a 10th century Midrashic collection. Get ready for this. So the point of Yaakov sending Yosef out was to complete the prophecy that was given between God and the Chaver Na'eh. Chaver Na'eh, the good friend, the pleasant friend. Who's the Chaver Na'eh? Avraham. And where is he buried? Chevron. Chaver Na'eh. Right? Chevron Nituna Bahar Elik Parshat Rabbanan. And so the Psikta then makes it an explicit statement. Chevron's in a mountain. How can you call it a valley? It must be that this midrash is what it's saying. Right? Breshit midrash Breshit Rabbah, same thing. Following Chevron Nituna Ela Bahar Chtiv Shtachem Emek Chevron. Ra'acha alach lashlim ota itzah mukash tarkosh baruch hu beino ubein chaver hana'eh. Sha'akavur b'Chevron. Again, that the Eitzah Mukah is associated with the Chaver Na'eh buried in Hebron. Now, when you go to Yoshua, in the chapters of conquest, the chapters dividing, the end of the conquest, the beginning of dividing the land, we're told, V'shem Hebron lefanim Kiryat Arba. Meaning, we know what Hebron is. Hebron used to be called Kiryat Arba, which means the text is now giving us a sequence. It used to be called Kiryat Arba, and then it got called Hebron. And by the way, what's Kiryat Arba? Ha'adam Hagadol Banakimhu. That Arba is the big giant, right? In the next chapter in Yoshua, U'lechalev ben Yifunen natan chelek b'toch b'nei Yehuda al pi Adonai the Yoshua et Kiryat Arba avi anak hi Hebron. Meaning the city of Arba, the father of the giants, which is otherwise known as Hebron. But now we find out Hebron's the new name given to Kiryat Arba. Okay. And again, now you see throughout Yoshua, it's Kiryat Arba, Hi Hebron, Shem Hebron, Lefanim Kiryat Arba. Throughout, you almost never find Kiryat Arba mentioned without Hebron, and you almost never find Hebron mentioned without Kiryat Arba. Right? Now, again, as I mentioned before, we have other towns that have double names. We have Luz that Yaakov renames Beit El, but the difference is that the locals still call it Luz. They don't care that some Jew took a nap and called it Beit El. As far as they're concerned, it's Luz, which, by the way, means they're all, of course, losers. But Beit El is the name that we give it. All right, that's as far as there. So now, what we have is that the town that we call Kiryat Arba becomes Hebron. Why does it become Hebron? So one thing to note is that in place names in Israel, place names in Tanakh, the suffix Vav Nun often refers to a mountain. Livanon, Hermon, Sirion, Sion, Hebron, and there are others. And Shomron also, Har Shomron. And so Hebron seems to mean it's a mountain which has something to do with Chaver. I don't know why it gets called Hebron. You don't know why it's called Hebron. But there's a midrash that actually indicates why it's called Hebron. And what's that? We saw it. It's called Hebron because who's buried there? Chaver Na'eh. It is the mountain of the beautiful friend of God. Who's the beautiful friend of God? Avraham. And everybody recognizes the people of Hebron itself say to Avraham, you're a lordly man. We'd love to give you our land to bury your dead. He's the Chaver Na'eh. And so the place gets a new name based on Avraham. That's the midrash. Whether it's historically accurate, not our issue, that's the midrash. But this midrash ends up playing an interesting role in language. If you take a look here, and this is something you won't see too often certainly not in my shiurim, but if you look online, what is the name of the city that we're talking about in Arabic? So if you want to see what Tel Aviv is called in Arabic, you'll see it's called Tel Aviv. You want to see what Yavne is called? It's called Yibneh. You want to see what Beit El is called? It's called Beitin. You want to see what Malay Adumim is? It's pretty much a transliteration. Beit Lechem is Beit Lachem. Yerushalayim is different, of course. Yerushalayim is an interesting piece. What is Yerushalayim called in Arabic? I mean, you know?
Al-Quds.
Al-Quds, which means?
Makom Kadosh.
Actually, it means Hamikdash.
Holy city.
Hamikdash, which is interesting, of course, because of Arab denial of the existence of the Mikdash. Their own name for the place is Hamikdash. Right. What do they call Hebron? They don't call it Hebron. You can look this up online. They call it Al Khalil Ar Rahman, and you see it there. That's what the name is called. And by the way, notice what they say about Abraham. Right? And by the way, you find it also in Yeshayahu, that Abraham is my friend, says God, and there is nobody else that God says that about but Abraham. Zera Abraham Ohavi. Abraham, my friend, my beloved. And you see that it plays a central role in Islamic thinking. Take a look at this from Quran from Surah number 4. Who can be better in religion than one who submits his whole self to Allah, does good, and follows the way of Abraham, the true and faith, for Allah to take Abraham for a friend? I think he got it from us, obviously. But notice that this is Abraham, and what happens? The name of the town is Al Khalil Rahman. How did that happen? So Professor Yehuda Elitzur Zal made the following suggestion, and I think there's a lot to recommend it. He says, in the 6th and 7th and 8th centuries, we have records of the town of Hebron being a popular gathering spot. There was a marketplace there. There were Jews who lived there. The Jewish community still existed. It was small in Yehuda, but it existed. There were Christians who gathered there, and there were now Arabs, and by the late 7th century, already Muslims who would gather there and meet and trade, and they talk to each other. Now, what happens when a Jew comes in and says, you know why this place is called Hebron? Because our Abba Avraham is buried there, and Avraham is a Chaver Na'eh. The Muslims hear that, they love that. It's a great drasha, because Ibrahim is, of course, a very important person in their religion. Ibrahim is the father of Ismail. Very important. And so what do they end up naming the town? They name the town Khalil Ar-Rahman, the friend of God. That's what they call it. Because they pick up our midrash that the name Hebron is really because of the Chaver Na'eh, and then they translate that into their own language. The interesting piece about this town, which is highlighted this week, both in the Parsha and in the very big Shabbat Hebron that'll be happening starting tomorrow, with, again, a huge crowds descending. People are sleeping on floors and in tents and every sort of thing in order to be in Hebron for Parshat Chayei Sara, is that this town, in a sense, is the first hitnachalut, the first settlement of our people in Eretz Yisrael. Avram did not settle in the Shechem. He did not settle in between Beit El and Hai. He built Mizbachot and moved. He kept moving up and down the mountainous area. And as we saw in the first half of this year, the first place he settles in is Hebron. And we properly refer to Hebron as Ir Havot. Not just because Avram is buried there, and Yitzchak's buried there, and Yaakov's buried there, and their wives are buried there. But more importantly, because that was the point of their original involvement in the country, in the land, in their mission to try to spread the idea and the understanding of one universal God to whom everybody is accountable. Lasot tzedakah mishpat. And it starts in Hebron. And you see it whenever that town is mentioned, there's always an association with Hebron. Kiryat Arba, Hebron. Hebron used to be Kiryat Arba, now it's Hebron. And a constant repetition. And I believe that constant reminder of the two names is a constant reminder of the powerful impact that Abraham had on the people and on the land, and on the mission that Abraham started, that, of course, we are all adjured to continue. Okay. I spoke fast, so I finished 5 minutes earlier than I was supposed to, so I'm going to open it up for questions. Not in the chat. Talk. Fire away.
Okay, I have a question.
Fire away.
Kiryat Arba hi Hebron makes it a hyphenated city. As you know, in English, to have a hyphenated name means your nobility. In this case, it expresses the nobility of Hebron, and also identifies it with the double cave, Keva HaMachpelah.
Okay, so I'm sorry, what's the question?
Don't you think that would be an explanation for the double naming always?
You mean Kiryat Arba hi Hebron?
Yes.
Or Kiryat and Arba?
No, Kiryat Arba hi Hebron.
Well, where else do we find it though? The problem is you don't find that anywhere else with any other city. So
Because only Hebron is a hyphenated city. It's in
Yeah,
it
so
has
we're
special nobility,
so it's kind of hard to establish a pattern based on one example.
except that it's the Keva Machpelah, which is a very, very key. So Machpelah also means doubling.
That could be. There's certainly homiletic material there. I don't know that what we would do with that in Pshat, but it's an interesting thought. Anybody else?
Isn't it ironic that the three places that our vote went and paid for in Hebron, in Shechem, and in Yerushalayim is contested today?
You're right. Yeah, that's an old saw about that, about the fact that the Dafka, the places that we have, as it were, a contract, a written contract in the most popular book in history, the biggest bestseller, where it's contested. Yeah. Now you have to remember that some people will argue that Abraham bought it, and Abraham's our father too. So, but I agree with you. That is a sad irony of the ages.
Certainly, I'm a little confused. Why, when we have the Torah being very parsimonious about extra words, extra letters, it goes through Hebron, Kiryat Arba, Hebron. It keeps doing that again and again and again.
Right.
You think that it would settle on one name, whichever name is appropriate for that period. And as long as it's said someplace that it's the same, why do we have to keep repeating it and repeating it and repeating it?
Exactly. Good point, which is exactly the point that I made in this year also, that that's what strikes us as so odd. Normally, whenever there's a name, whether it's a personal name or a toponym that has two, the text says it once, and then every time you see either name, it's the other one also. And here it seems to say, so it seems that the Torah is really trying to stress the impact of Abraham, that Abraham had on the land, that the new name of the land is really something that was an impact of Abraham's presence there. One thing that we have to keep in mind is that the Torah's concision in language, at least Chazal's sensitivity to the Torah's concision in language or conciseness, is mainly focused on legal texts. In other words, we're not that bothered by a couple extra words, and of course, this week's Parsha is a great example of that, with the whole repetition of the story from the slave. We're not that bothered by repetitious text, and the greatest example, of course, is Bamidbar Zayin, where we have 66 extra psukim with the korbanot of each nasi. We are very bothered by extra words and even extra letters sometimes when it comes to legal texts. But I will agree with you that this is very unusual, and this is why what Dr. Hepner said is also difficult to put in, only because it's the only example of it. It really stands out. And so I'm suggesting that it stands out that way because, again, the Torah is trying to share with us the impact that Abraham had on the land. But if you got a better answer, I'm certainly open to it. I don't sleep great from that answer, but I try to find other things to calm me when I sleep. Anybody else?
Do we know why Abraham's children didn't make a shiva quote for their mother?
You mean why Yitzchak doesn't show up?
And Yishmael didn't show up either.
Well,
for burial, yes, but not
first of all, it's
shiva.
important to know that we don't know. We don't know. We don't know that they didn't come. We don't hear that they did come. It could be they came and we don't hear about it. We do hear that Yitzchak and Ishmael both show up to bury Avraham. I'm more bothered by Yitzchak's absence during the arrangements for the funeral, because I don't know that anybody is sitting shiva then, right? The first time we hear of shiva is when Yaakov dies, right? Or any sort of a vilut period. But let's say that there's mourning, but I'm more bothered by the fact that Yitzchak's not there when she dies and to help with the funeral arrangements. And I think to understand that, and I don't have an answer, I think to understand that we have to look into the Akedah and the impact of the Akedah on Yitzchak and on Yitzchak's relationship with Avraham. Because again, Yitzchak and Avram are not living in the same city anymore. And they don't seem to see each other again and Avram again seems to hand off his servant and says, go get the wife, and then you become Yitzchak's servant. So, I don't know, difficult. In any case, I want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. Thank you very much for participating. It's a pleasure
Thank
to
you.
see many of you and to see your names on the screen many cases. And have a wonderful, wonderful Shabbat. And for those of you who are south of the border, I wish you a very happy Thanksgiving. For those of you north of the border, you already had your Thanksgiving. When
We
is
just have
Thanksgiving?
winter. We have winter.
No, but in Canada, when's Thanksgiving? It's early, right?
A long time, a month ago.
Okay, good. So hopefully everybody will have much to give thanks to every day to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Have a great Shabbat.
Thank you very much.